It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Nigel FABB to all of you. Nigel FABB is Professor of Literary Linguistics at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. He has a BA in Literature from Cambridge and a PhD in Linguistics from MIT. He was editor of the Journal of Linguistics from 1997 to 2014 and is the author of 10 books, including a descriptive grammar of the Sudanic language Madi, did I pronounce it correctly? Yeah, okay. Written with Mary Blackings, and 4 books on linguistics as applied to literature. These 4 books include a survey of literary linguistics, a study of literary form from a pragmatic perspective, and, with Maurice Halley, a new theory of poetic meter. The most recent of these books is What is Poetry?, which links poetry to the psychology of working memory. He has recently published articles on poetic closure, on parallelism, and on brilliance as a characteristic of Australian Aboriginal ceremonies. He held the Leverhulme Fellowship from 2014 to 2017 to study epiphanies from psychological and literary linguistic perspectives, and is developing this into a book on experiences of profound ineffability, exploring the notion that they begin with a schematically discrepant perception. Please help me welcome Professor FABB.
Thank you, Sarah and Rocco, for organising what looks like it's going to be a fantastic conference. So the question that I'm going to address in this paper is this question, which is, we know that literary texts have quantitative characteristics as evidenced by digital humanities research. And in the paper I'm going to draw on psychology and linguistics to examine how knowledge might be structured so that it corresponds to quantitative characteristics of literary texts. That's my goal. So, as I understand quantitative studies of literary texts, I think people do basically 2 things. First of all, they decide what they're going to be describing. So it's either a single text or a set of texts, where the set of text is a corpus, and that might represent a tradition or an author's works or be defined in some other way. And then the second question for quantitative studies is whether the data is ordered or not. So you have basically a bag approach or a series approach. And a bag approach is unordered data, as in a bag of words approach, which is a very widely used way of doing quantitative work, where you basically just think about, not about where the words are in a text, but what words are in a text. And that's Hernan's language in the mass. And then the other approach would be a series approach, where you take an approach where you look at the data as it's ordered. And examples of that would be time series modelling, or the corpus understood over historical time, or the literary text as sequenced object, and that's Hernan's language in the line. And bigrams and other engrams, for example, would be a kind of micro-sequencing of data. So you basically have a bag or a series approach, and you can combine them. So you can bag sequences. So you can bag a set of bigrams. Each bigram itself as a series, and then you look at them as a whole in a bag in the text. Or you can do it the other way around. That is, you can treat a text as a bag of data, but then historically sequence them. And I'm going to assume that there are 2 kinds of knowledge. So remember, I'm going to match up the quantitative aspects of the data with kinds of knowledge. And I'm going to assume 2 kinds of knowledge following Jerry Fodor. Modularized knowledge and general knowledge. So modularized knowledge is knowledge that's organized in a specific way, as rules or constraints or types of representation, and that's basically the approach to knowledge that Chomsky introduced in the 1950s. And linguistic theory assumes modularized knowledge. Some aspects of literary knowledge may also be modularized as well, so it's possible that metricality is actually a specialized kind of knowledge that we have that enables us to do it. And then you have non-modularized knowledge, which is just general knowledge. And I'm going to assume that general knowledge is made up of schemata, and that includes propositions, that is thoughts, that are processed by inferencing, and so on. And you can structure both kinds of knowledge in ways that can produce or correspond to quantitative characteristics of the data. The knowledge needn't be itself quantitative, but it can be organized so that it produces regularities in the data. So we might ask how quantitative characteristics of data are caused, because when people study through quantitative approaches, they find quantitative results. What's causing them? So I think there are 3 ways of thinking about it. The first is that psychology might play a role, and that's the focus of the paper. It's also possible that there are non-psychological factors that are playing a role. And in fact, of course, there are many possible causal factors. This is one of the problems with studying literature from a scientific perspective, of course, which is that causation is really multiple and extremely complex when it comes to literary texts. But that doesn't stop us trying to understand it. And I want to give you two examples of ways of thinking about data that have different sorts of explanations. One comes from David McClure, and that's just from his Twitter feed, Clured, where he talks about the distribution of words across narrative time within a novel. And so he shows that words such as hair, he looks at 30,000 novels, I think, and he finds that hair and nose are particularly commonly used at the beginning of a novel, whereas arms and hands particularly commonly used at the end. And the explanation that he has of that is that that's the way narratives are structured. So narratives basically have to introduce characters at the beginning, more and more at the beginning than towards the end. On the other hand, endings are often about emotional reconciliation or emotion of some kind, and arms and hands are more emotional than hair and nose. And that's basically the argument. Now, that's not really a psychological explanation. I mean, it draws to some extent on psychology, but it's really an explanation about the structure of novels that seeks to explain the quantitative data. Another example I want to use is an example of my own, which is the use of as a word in Paradise Lost. If you look at the lines in Paradise Lost that use the word of, then 28% of those lines begin with the word of. So that's a fact about the data of Paradise Lost, and it's relative to the line. So it's not. You can bag it. You can treat it as a bigram. You can say line boundary plus of is a bigram, and then you could basically bag it. But it also relates to the beginning of the text, which is not exactly a bag issue. It's more of a series issue, because the first two lines in Paradise Lost also begin with the word of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal tastes. If you look at later writers, you can see that they do something similar, but more so. This is a rather random sample, it has to be said. So Anna Barbauld has a poem called To Mr. Coleridge. She uses of 14 times, and 7 of those times are at the beginning of a line. And here's a couple of examples on the screen. Wordsworth in Tintin Abbey uses of 60 times, 23 of them are line initial. So of 5 years have passed, 5 summers were the length of 5 young, but that's the beginning of Tintin Abbey. So what's the explanation for that, assuming that it's a regularity that we need to explain? Well, the explanation that I came to in my 2002 book was I suggested that of is being used here as a line marker, as a line boundary marker, because there's a more than chance, at a higher rate than chance. If you hear the word of, it's a reasonably good guess that that might be at the beginning of a line. And in a blank verse without rhyme, how do you know where the beginnings of lines are? So it's basically a way of helping you find line boundaries in blank verse by allowing of to emerge as weak evidence for a line boundary. So that's one kind of explanation that depends on knowledge, and in fact on effectively statistical knowledge. But it's also possible to think of it in other terms. So maybe Barbauld and Wordsworth are using of a lot, not because it's a line boundary marker, but because Milton did it. So there's another sort of explanation, again, that relates to literary history. But that's not a psychological explanation. That's an explanation in terms of imitation or the tradition. So these two examples are really just there to give an example of the complexity of trying to explain things, which is obvious anyway, but nevertheless, I'm going to use it. OK, so statistical learning, then. So, right. Statistical learning is, I think, the connection between knowledge and the text. And we know that people, all animals, but humans as well, can learn in such a way that they can produce a predictable statistical outcome. That's statistical learning. And what we know about statistical learning, and here I depend on the work by Siegelman and Frost, statistical learning is modularized. That means that how you learn visual information is different from how you learn auditory information, for example. How you learn auditory information. Sorry, that's one of the aspects of it. It's more complex than that too. So it's not just visual versus auditory, but what kind of visual, as opposed to some kinds of visual as opposed to other kinds of visual. But people are able to learn statistically, but it varies depending on what they're trying to learn. It's stable within a module for an individual. So a person who's good at statistical learning of visual information will remain good at doing it. They produce that finding by doing test-to-test reliability over 3 months. So it's not a lifetime of stability, but we might assume that it's stable over the lifetime. But, and this is the important thing about statistical learning, it's variable between individuals. So some people are good at statistical learning of a particular kind, and other people aren't. Some people perform no better than chance in statistical learning tasks. So it's an inter-individual variable. That's going to turn out to be important. Statistical learning can produce both modularized knowledge and general knowledge, and I'm going to show how. And remember that what's statistically learned needn't itself be statistical. So you can learn such that you can make judgments about or produce data that is statistically regular, but that what you've learned isn't itself statistical. It isn't itself numerical. It's just organized in such a way that it's possible to produce that outcome. And again, I'm going to come back to that later on and show you why. So there's an issue about causation. There's a direction causation issue, and that for some kinds of learning, the causal direction is one way. So if we're learning about the natural world, for example, the sun, we learn statistical data about that. We can't really change the statistical data about the sun. We can just learn it. But when it comes to literary text, both directions of causation are possible. So statistical learning might, on the one hand, be shaped by the statistical properties of the text. That's what you're learning. On the other hand, as a writer, you're creating statistical properties of the text. In turn, you're probably creating them on the basis of what you learn from other texts. So statistical learning basically goes in both directions. It's both production and reception. Now, I think one of the interesting things about statistical learning is it raises questions about stylometric consistency. So one of the views in stylometrics, so stylometrics is authorial fingerprinting. It's the idea that you can judge the authorship of a text by looking at aspects of their style, usually the tiny aspects of the style, like how they use articles or demonstratives. And one of the views, I guess, in the stylometric community is that authors are stylometrically consistent. Otherwise, you couldn't fingerprint them. In other words, they're like real fingerprints. They don't change. And here's Boyd and Pennebaker. They say language use is consistent within person across time and content. And, of course, that's produced from experimental results. So that's a reliable finding. But we've got to learn what we do. So if a writer is statistically consistent, then that must arise by statistical learning. That's a bit of a leap there, but that's a leap I'm going to make. If you perform statistically coherently, then you've done it by statistical learning. You basically learned such that you can perform statistically. That means it's statistical learning. But remember that people vary in how good they are at statistical learning. So that raises a question about writers. So writers should actually vary. Some of them should be better statistical learners than others. In fact, some of them might be not good statistical learners at all. But that ought to correlate with how consistent they are stylometrically too. So it should not be true that language use is consistent within person across time and content. In fact, we should find that it's quite variable depending on how good they are as statistical learners for those aspects of language that are relevant in writing. So we ought to expect that it won't be. This rather challenges the notion that they should be consistent from a psychological perspective, even though that's the finding. Then there's some other questions. So if authors are stylometrically consistent, then a reader can statistically learn the style of that writer, in principle. And then we might ask how demarcated our statistical learnings are. So, for example, do we learn Shakespeare's iambic pentameter? Shakespeare produces iambic pentameter differently from Milton. Shakespeare learnt differently from Milton. He learnt statistically different from Milton. He's producing a different statistical output. As readers, do we do the same? In other words, do we read Milton differently from the way we read Shakespeare because we, in a sense, learn different meters? And does that mean that we experience, effectively, things like metrical tension differently in Shakespeare and in Milton? I mean, that's really a finding that I think comes out of this broad way of looking at it. So I think that's an interesting finding from statistical learning, which is something I'm going to stick with, but that's a finding that reflects back on the notion of stylometric consistency. Right, now I turn to modularized knowledge. So modularized knowledge of literary form means that there are specialized rule or constraint systems that govern literary linguistic production and reception. There are special forms of poetry. So poetry, first of all, is divided into lines. That's one of the characteristics of poetry, although, in fact, that's not really a specialized kind of knowledge. Line division is, in a sense, arbitrary. But meter, rhyme, alliteration, and parallelism may indeed use specialized kinds of knowledge. So they are modularized kinds of knowledge. And then we might ask whether they are processed in specific constrained ways, and if so, why? And there are two sorts of explanation, and they both might be right. So one is that they're processed by a distinct module, so there might be a meter module in the brain, or maybe a phonology module that's used by the meter module, because there might be psychological constraints as well. So maybe there's a combination of two different factors here, a linguistic one and a general psychological one that's producing that modularity. Now, memory and perception systems are constrained. That's very, very well known from psychology. And in my most recent book, I argue that literary form is constrained by working memory limits. So working memory can only hold up to a certain amount of material. It's basically, it's quantized, so you can maybe hold 4 chunks of material in working memory at a time. And what I argue in the book is that lines are relatively short, because lines are the things that meters refer to, or that rhymes refer to, or that alliteration refers to, or that parallelism refers to. And when a form depends on a sectioning of text, those sections always seem to need to be quite small. And I suggest that that's because there's an independent constraint on the section of text which is to do with working memory, suggesting that those forms are actually operating working memory. And I think this in turn has an interesting relationship to a claim that's made in the quantitative work. Excuse me, I keep looking at my phone. I'm just checking my timing here, which is unfortunate. There we go. So the relationship. So this is a relationship to one of the things that comes out of, for example, the Stanford Literary Lab, and the suggestion that there are two sorts of scale, or multiple sorts of scale. So the Algee-Hewitt article, which includes, I think, Ryan Hoyes is one of the authors of this. In literature, different scales activate different structural features. So the point that they make in this pamphlet is that the kind of style that you get, or the style that you can find, depends on the size of object that you're looking at. Now that has a sort of relationship to this notion of capacity limits that's set by memory. It's not the same, but I think there's an interesting sort of synergy between those two ideas. So modularized knowledge also relates to metrical form. And metrical form, the way meters work is that the line matches a metrical template, but depending on the meter, variation is possible. So, for example, iambic pentameter is a very strict metrical template. It's very periodic. It goes weak strong, weak strong, weak strong, weak strong, weak strong. But the actual rhythm of the line need not be. So the rhythm of the line can be much more aperiodic than the meter. So you get variation, and some variations are much more common than others, and some variations are so rare that we might say that they're unmetrical. And it's possible to describe that variable relationship between metrical template and metrical lines quantitatively for a corpus. So, as Tarlinskaja has shown in lots of work, and indeed other people have shown too. And here's an example. So this is an example of a poem, and this poem's in iambic pentameter, so the meter is always the same, it's always highly periodic, but the rhythms aren't. So huge sponges of millennial growth and height, for example, is a line that does not have a regular periodic rhythm. And indeed, if you look at the rhythms of the lines here, I won't go through them, the rhythms of the lines are variable, they change, but they change within a range of limits. And that's describable for a corpus in statistical terms. Metrical theory tries to understand the relationship between the phonological form of the line and the metrical form of the template, and understands it in terms of constraints. And I'm going to assume an optimality theory approach here. So in optimality theory, some constraints can be more easily violated than others, and the ranking of constraints permits metrical variation and identifies some variations as unmetrical. And you can rank them, or partially rank them, and by doing so, you can produce an output that has quantitative characteristics. Now, you don't have to attach quantities to the conditions or to the constraints. You can organize the constraints in ways that produce quantitatively regular outputs. Or you can attach quantities to the constraints, as happens in stochastic optimality theory. But in that approach, the quantities that attach to the constraints don't correspond directly to the quantities in the data. So there's an indirect relationship between the organization of the data and the quantitative facts of the world. But there is a relationship between them. So in this sense, this kind of modularized knowledge is formulated such that it does explain quantitative aspects of the data. I think it's one of the successes of metrics, is to be able to do that. Right, and that's the last point at the bottom, that the statistical properties of the corpus are learned without incorporating statistics in the learning itself. You don't have to incorporate statistics themselves. You can statistically learn without making statistics happen in your head, in other words. So the conclusion is that it's possible to organise modularised knowledge in specific ways relating to the constraint or rule systems that govern that knowledge, such that the knowledge matches the statistical properties of the data. So that's quite good for modularised knowledge, although I've only given one example, and it's not original with me. It originates with other people in this room, in fact, by which I mean Paul Kapowski. So match in this case can mean producing the data as an author does, or assessing the data as a reader does. So you're matching your knowledge up to the data in the external world. Right, now I want to move on to general knowledge, which I think raises, this is really going to be the bulk of what I'm going to say now about general knowledge. And how we can understand that in terms of the corpus. So general knowledge is the knowledge in semantic memory. That's just how I'm going to describe it. I mean, there's different ways of thinking about what general knowledge is, but I'm going to assume it's what's in semantic memory. And I'm also going to assume that semantic memory is basically made of schemata. That's what you've got there. And I'm going to blur the issues a little bit here, it doesn't matter too much. And I'm going to define schema after Rummel, Hart and Alternate as a representation of the generalised concepts, underlying objects, situations, events, sequences of events, actions and sequences of actions. That's basically what we know in a generalised way, is what's in a schema. And I'm going to assume that thoughts, or propositions which constitute thoughts, are subtypes of schema. That might be not quite right, but it'll have to do. And they also constitute what you get in general knowledge. And I'm going to assume a relevance theoretic approach to that, although I'm not going to say anything about relevance theory. Just that's the approach I'm going to take. Now, modularised knowledge of the kind that we just saw when we got to metrics is likely to be quite small in range. So it's going to account for some kinds of literary form, but not most kinds of literary form. Pretty much everything that happens in a novel can't really be involving modularized knowledge. If it's literature specific, it must be involving general knowledge. So we have to think about how general knowledge can also be understood in terms of its relation to quantitative data. And if we think of a general knowledge as being made of schemata, including propositions, then we can differentiate schemata along scales. And that's useful because it allows us to understand how what we have in our heads, the thoughts that we have in our heads, have characteristics such that they can match quantitatively regular characteristics of the world and the way we behave in the world. And I think there are three kinds of differentiation. This is a bit rough, really, but there are three kinds of differentiation for how we could differentiate schemata. First relates to the probability of schemata matching perceptions, and this is basically predictive processing. So the idea is that when we experience the world, we're constantly perceiving things, but actually what we perceive is preempted by what we think we're going to see. So we're throwing schemata forwards constantly out of our semantic memory as predictions for what we're going to perceive, and then we match our perceptions against what we predicted. But those predictions are weighted, so it's not that we're never certain about what we're going to see. So every schema has a percentage, as a probability attached to it, and that's governing how we experience the world. So that's one way of quantizing or organising schemata such that they produce quantitative characteristics. Second one is the probability of that proposition being available for inferencing. So that's a different point. That's not what we're perceiving right now, but if I talk to you, then I'm assuming that you're going to have some thoughts more available than others in terms of understanding what I'm saying. And that availability of thoughts is, again, quantizable. So some thoughts are more available than others. That's another quantitative characteristic of thought. And then the third one is the probability of them being true. So this is not so much the probability of my seeing something or experiencing something. This is just the probability of truth of a thought. And again, I think those things are variable. And relevance theory has a notion of weak implicatures, for example, which are thoughts that we derive, but we're not that sure are true. So there's a third way of scalar differentiating thoughts. And I think it's possible to think of all those scalar differentiations as having a relationship to what we get out in the world when we look at the quantity, the data we produce, the quantified data that we're producing in digital humanities. So how can we understand literary form, for example, as the content of thoughts? Because what I've said is that most of what we know about literature has got to be the content of thoughts. And that includes literary form. And I'm going to assume that that's true, for example, of being a sonnet. So I'm going to assume, for example, that this is a sonnet, holds of a text. Sonnets, text are sonnets. But that text is a sonnet by virtue of being the content of a thought about a sonnet, about the text. So it's not that it's a fact about the text that it's a sonnet, a determinate objective fact. No, it's the content of a thought that we have about the text. And that thought is well evidenced by characteristics of the text. That's the claim that I'm making. That's the claim I made in my 2002 book. Now, that should be true of any kind of literary form that doesn't have its own modularized knowledge. Basically, there isn't a special system for that form. So that form's just got to be the content of thoughts. Whatever kind of thing we mean by form, it's got to be the content of thoughts. And that can be true of meter as well. So metrical form might be partly organised or organised in one way by a metrical type of knowledge. So iambic pentameter, that's a system that we're running in our heads that's specialised for that meter. But at the same time, recognising that a line is in iambic pentameter is part of general knowledge. That's not a specialised system that gets you there. It's just what we know about literature, that we know it's in iambic pentameter. So we might have one without the other. We might be able to run the meter in our heads without knowing that it's that meter. So literary forms of this kind can be modelled as the content of thoughts. And here's two examples. So one might be the thought, if a poem has 14 lines, then it's a sonnet. And if a poem has a sonnet, then it has 14 lines. And they differ in their truth value. So if a poem has 14 lines and it's a sonnet, that's not that true. It's somewhat true, but it's not that true. Whereas if a poem has a sonnet that has 14 lines, it's much higher. Not completely true either, but it's higher. So that's what I mean by saying that form is the content of thoughts. And then that takes us to a particular text. This is the text we saw before. It's by Tennyson. It's called a Kraken. Is it a sonnet? Well, it looks a bit like one. So that's one reason for thinking it's a sonnet. It's got the right rhyme pattern for a sonnet, sort of. If you look at the end, green lies sleep, sleep seen die. That looks a bit like a sonnet ending. So there are a number of reasons for inferring that it's a sonnet. And to that degree, it is a sonnet. That's what it means to be a sonnet. It means it's the content of my thoughts about the text that it's a sonnet. But it's got 15 lines. That's a bit of a problem. So having 15 lines goes against one of the relatively strong beliefs we have about sonnets, which is that they have 14 lines. But that belief need not be absolute. So we can, to some extent, override it. Right, so we can, again, we can allow the probabilities or quantities that we attach to knowledge to allow this to be accepted as a kind of weak sonnet. Yeah, it's not exactly a sonnet, but it's like one. So let's think about it as if it's a sonnet. That's a useful thing to do. And certainly in this I'm disagreeing with not Roy Fuller, it's John Fuller. the Oxford Book of Sonnets. This is actually why I started with this. I just read this and I thought, oh, yeah, okay, let's see. Because it seems to me that it's useful to think about it as a sonnet. Fuller doesn't want to do it, but that's because Fuller has, as one of his beliefs, if it's a sonnet, it must have 14 lines. That's 100% probability attached to that. It's an absolute certainty for him. But for me, it's not. So the variability of your thoughts about text, it relates to what you think about what form is, actually. And more generally, I've suggested that's true of genre. So I've suggested that genre in general must be the content of thoughts about text. So it's a subjective thing. But it also turns out to be objective as well. And so projects like DocuScope, which my colleague Jonathan Hope and Mike Whitmore used to run all the Shakespeare plays through, they found that it's possible to differentiate the tragedies and the histories from the comedies by virtue of the language of those texts. So that's a fact about the text. That's a data fact. So there is a relationship between those objective characteristics of the text and subjective characteristics of the text too, but I think they can be reconciled. So basically what you say is that, well, one of part of how we infer that a text is a sonnet is we're taking into account that quantitative data too. We're learning statistically from the data, and that's part of how we decide what things are. But again, it's variable. You know, it's not, these aren't absolutes that we're dealing in here. These are probabilities that we're dealing in. Right. So, the last part of the text, the last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about sequence, and I'm going to spend about 20 minutes now talking about the issue of sequence, where it gets much more difficult to think about the relationship between knowledge and quantitative characteristics of the data. So sequential aspects of literature text are under-described in quantitative accounts, and that's for good methodological reasons. It's hard to study sequence quantitatively. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And in this section, I consider various kinds of sequence that are found in literary text that may be processed by knowledge that itself was statistically learned, and I'm going to think about how quantitative approaches might approach them. So this is the hardest question, I think, of thinking about how knowledge relates to data, is to think about sequence. Sequence is a pretty hard thing to get at. So let's start with very local sequences. So very local sequences can easily be studied in quantitative work. So for example, when you look at bigrams, a bigram is a sequence of two words, a fixed sequence of two words, and you can look for that sequence in a text. Right, that's a sequence, easy to do in quantitative terms. And indeed, they do have some psychological reality. So MacDonald and Richard Shilcock show that a word's bigram probability does predict reading times. So that's part of how we read, is in terms of bigrams. So there's a relationship between the probabilities that we throw out at the world from what we know and bigrams in a text. We've somehow learnt that too. So there is a relationship between that micro-sequence and what we know. But, as linguists, any linguist will tell you that there's a problem about n-gram models in language, which is that, yes, for sure, sequence is important in language, but there's all sorts of other things that are important too. So language involves constituency, it involves long-distant relations, and those things are not seen at all by bigrams, or indeed any n-grams, because it's not about sequence. As Chomsky showed in 1957, the way we think about sentences is not sequentially. We think about them as constituent structures. So although bigrams and n-grams they do work, they do relate to some extent to how we know language, there's got to be other things going on as well. Next topic, I'm just going to hop from topic to topic here, is entropy of vocabulary. So entropy basically is how wide the range of words that you can use at any moment in a text. And we might ask what causes a specific level of entropy in a text. And so Eliot's 2016 article from which I first got this notion that one would be looking at this, this is how he describes it. Entropy is a measure of disorder, it's a measure of vocabulary richness. Now, Eliot points out that entropy levels can change in the course of a text. So a single novel might have different levels of entropy at different parts. In fact, on the whole, you're going to get higher entropy at the beginning of a novel than at the end, because at the beginning, pretty much everything is new. So all the words that you're introducing are new words at the beginning of the novel. But it's going to die off towards the end. Once you've introduced Mr. Rochester, then every time you get Rochester after that, that's not a new word, right? So there are various kinds of explanations for entropy of vocabulary. There are non-psychological explanations, which are basically the ones that come out of, I guess, the Stanford lab and also Eliot's work. So the Stanford lab people point out, for example, that representations of speech in novels have lower entropy than representations of writing, or as writing in novels. In Adam Bede, one of the least entropic parts of Adam Bede, the novel by George Eliot, is a bit of speech. So that's the distinction that's made. That's not psychological, really. I mean, it comes back to psychology, but it's not really a psychological distinction. It's a medium distinction. And then Eliot himself argues that if you produce your text more quickly, then it's got lower entropy, because basically you're trying to reduce effort, and reducing effort means lower entropy. There's less it's more regular. And he looks at Harlequin romances, which are a kind of cheap romance novels, and he says they are high entropy in the beginning, and then after that it falls off completely. Very little entropy after that. And he says it's because they get written fast. And he compares Jane Austen, who actually has very regular entropy throughout, different kind of writer, and he looks at Dickens, and he says, well, Dickens is like a romance, like a Harlequin romance in a way. Dickens has a lot of entropy at the beginning, then it really falls off for most of it, and then it picks up at the end. Why does it fall off? Dickens had to write fast. That's the claim he makes. That's not a psychological explanation, not really. It sort of is, but it isn't really. It's about how fast you write. Then there are psychological questions that we might ask. So Jane Austen turns out to be consistently atropic. And these two articles, Algee-Hewitt and Eliot, which were published at the same time but didn't know about each other, say the same thing about Eliot. They say Eliot is consistently entropic throughout as a writer. That's kind of a stylometric point, and possibly relates to how she is as a statistical learner. What kind of a statistical learner is she, such that she's able to behave in this statistical way? And then another example might be comparing Homer with Virgil. So Homer, and this is based on no evidence whatsoever, so I'm just going to say it and just assume that it's true. I think it's probably true to say at some level that Homer has lower entropy than Virgil. Homer does repeat himself. He has repeated sections, oral formulae, etc., etc. Virgil doesn't. So Virgil worked quite hard not to have repetition. In fact, one of the claims about why the Aeneid is not finished is because Virgil couldn't find lines that didn't repeat themselves at that point, and so he wasn't quite happy with the lines, so he didn't finish it entirely. Now, several explanations for that. So one might be oral versus written. If Homer's an oral producer, maybe that's why he has lower entropy. Maybe that correlates there. Or it may be that Virgil has higher entropy because he was thinking about Homer. We know that Virgil was very conscious of Homer, and so that entropy may be a way of reacting against a statistical characteristic of Homer's text that Virgil's kind of learned but doesn't want to use. So again, you get the issues about psychology there. Right, here's another case in which sequence is important. So sometimes data depends on the immediately preceding content. So Antilla, for example, distinguishes local variation from global variation. In local variation, your choice of a variable is not free. It depends on a preceding use of the same word, for example. So you can't just look at them as a bag of words. That's not a bag. It's a dependent relationship between parts of the text. That's a problem, in some ways, for bag of words approaches. Then you have things like persistence. So Mary Tominga's work on persistence in sociolinguistics, where the choice of a socio-phonological variable, a choice of a sound, might depend on someone else's choice of a recent choice of the same sound. So again, you get a local variation. And indeed, accommodation, which is what you get also in discourse, when people accommodate to each other's axes. That's going to be locally dependent too. So you get all these local dependencies. And then in literature, you get parallelism. Parallelism is a very common phenomenon in literature. That can't really be understood in bag terms, because parallelism, what you get here is dependent on what you've just said somewhere else. Right, so there's extremely strong dependencies between the data there that you need to think about sequence to get at them. Now here's an example from my ex-student Liz Finnegan, who's recently got and she's got an example of this up on the Literary Universal's website. So Literary Universal's website, little promo here. Literary Universal's website is a website that Patrick Hogan is running at the University of Connecticut. I'm one of the editors of it, and I'm one of the editors of it. And people are basically putting up short articles discussing literary universals, and I would recommend people to, if they've got any ideas, to just submit stuff to us. Anyway, so Liz Finnegan, she has this idea about what she calls stereotyped sequences of space in novels. She suggests that verbal narratives contain what she calls topological sequences, topological frames of description, which produce systematic patterns of spatial representation. In other words, within a novel, every now and then narrative stops and you get a description. But the way those descriptions are organised turns out to be regular. She found this by doing rather informal work. She just read lots of novels. She didn't do a statistical analysis of this, although one might be able to. It illustrates the role of medium-sized sequences, and it might have I'm going to give you an example in a moment. It might have a psychological explanation. And the explanation that she suggests is it might be based on visual processing. So maybe that it looks as if the way that these scenes get described in novels is a very slowed down version of the way people look at things, which is weird, right? But appears to be true. So just to give you an example. So here's some sequences they're all from Jane Eyre as it happens. The first is what she calls a setting frame. It's when you look at a landscape and you move proximal to distal. So you start out close and you keep moving further out. Lawn, field, wood, church, road, hill, sun. Very, very common pattern. she shows that it's even true in novels like Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, where even though you have to work hard to understand what's being said, it turns out when you find it, it follows the same sequence. If you get a landscape, it still moves out towards the distal. In rooms, you get a different kind of pattern. So rooms tend to be described in ways that go from centre to edge. Right? So chairs, curtains edge, carpet centre, walls edge, ceiling centre, sideboard edge. Right, you get that movement backwards and forwards. And she shows, in fact, that if you look at 20th century novels like Hemingway, you find that external environments are also described as if they're rooms. So Paris in Hemingway is like a room, the way it's described. So that's, again, a sequential characteristic of the text. And then people are organised, well, she has two different frames for people, but one of them is you start with the outline, then you go to the head, then you go to the body, and then, in fact, you bounce backwards and forwards between head and body. So that's a sequential characteristic of the text. It's hard to find if you do quantitative work, but it seems to be showing up, and it ought to be influencing how data gets organised in terms of text. So texts don't... This is another point now, so I'm just moving along rather rapidly here. One of the things that we know about literary text, that we all know about literary text, is that they're not uniform. So when I talk to my students, I say, you know, texts they're not plains, they're not deserts just stretching out as far as the eye can see. They're mountain ranges, texts are. Some bits are much more important than the others. The beginning is really important, the ending is really important. And then, as Leboeuf and Walewski showed in their account of narratives in oral narratives, is that when you get to the point of a narrative, when you get to the resolution of a complication in a narrative, you do something stylistically. You mark it out in a certain way. Maybe you repeat or you use a modal that you haven't used before. But it's stylistically marked at that point. And indeed, the general point of markedness is that markedness is often sequentially located. Right? That the form is not uniform throughout. So again, a bag approach won't capture that. You need to think serially about novels and how they're thought of. Here's a more specific example. This is poetic closure. So this is Barbara Herrnstein-Smith. I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but just to summarise what she says. So Barbara Herrnstein-Smith basically says that when you read a poem, or when you read a poem really, you're making predictions that then get met or indeed violated at the end of the text. So that's basically what happens at the end, is the predictions are tested really significantly at the end. And she has this point there, which she says, one of the most common and substantial sources of closure effects is the terminal modification of a formal principle, by which she means the form is different at the end. Maybe it becomes more regular. Or, as I point out in my article about this, it becomes more irregular. But both happen. And just to give you an example of that, this is the end of Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Browning. There they stood ranged along the hillsides, met to be the last of me, a living frame for one more picture. In a sheet of flame I saw them, and I knew them all. And yet, dauntless, the slug horn to my lips I set, and blue Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. That last line is a closure line, and it does two things at the same time. It's both satisfies expectations, that's the shift. It's more regular than the other lines are in some ways. It's a complete clause. None of the other lines are. So the clause to line matching is very strong in that last line. And it also repeats the title, and in fact it tells us that we've arrived where we're expecting to go. So it's very expectation meeting, that last line. But it does something at the same time that's the opposite, which is it's the most irregular rhythmically, or in a certain way the most irregular rhythmically, because it has three sequences of strong stresses. Blue Childe Row and Dark Tower Came. It's the only line in the poem that does that. The only line that has two sequences of three stressed syllables. So it's the most irregular line. But the point is the same. The point is that the form is different at the end. Right? And that needs to be taken into account. Now, moving into the final point that I'm going to make in the paper, and this is moving a little bit more into the work that I've been doing over the past few years, to the expectations. So one of the characteristics of sequence is expectation is involved in it. And this has been very heavily studied in music theory, so music psychology, going back to Leonard Meyer in the 1950s, more recently David Huron. The psychology of music experiences depends on expectations, which are created and they're either met or violated. And that fits with predictive processing accounts. Clark is a good summary of that, and then Schaefer and so on is a summary of how it works with music. So we basically have weighted schemata, which predict our predictions, or perceptions. So we have a quantified kind of knowledge that predicts what we're going to hear, which are then compared against what we do hear. And then when they violate those schemata, what we hear is unexpected. We have to change what we know. We have to change the quantitative aspects of what we know. That produces surprise. And surprise can be emotional too. So you can get thrills and awe, or laughter or tears from surprise. So this takes me into the notion of the epiphany. So epiphanies is a term that it's actually used in far too many ways to be useful, but I use the term epiphanies because it sounds good and people like the sound of it. What I really mean by epiphany is an experience of significant ineffability. It's a moment when you suddenly come to feel that you know something important, but you can't put it into words. And we get those things from literary texts. And I'm suggesting that the way they arise is pretty much the same way that surprise emerges in music. That is, that you're violating, it's a radical violation of expectation. It's a schematically discrepant perception. And I have a whole sort of theoretical way of working this through. And there ought to be a relationship between the quantitative aspects of data, what we read when we read, and our ability to be surprised by a text, which in turn feeds into these very powerful experiences of emotion. I'll give you an example. Oh, sorry, this is William James. So William James describes these things. We are often surprised at the cutaneous shiver which like a sudden wave flows over us, or in the next part, the simplest rudiment of mystical experience, that deepened sense of the significance of a maximal formula which occasionally sweeps over us. That's what I'm talking about. These are the kinds of experiences that I mean. And to give you an example of it, Virginia Woolf. This is the end of the penultimate chapter of To the Lighthouse. I love this. In fact, I'm getting chills even now, even though I've only just turned the slide on, and my legs are beginning to go off underneath me here. I love this bit. I think it both represents an epiphanic moment for the characters, but also it produces them in readers. I mean, Woolf originally thought of ending the novel this way, but she didn't. She ends it in another epiphanic way as well, incidentally. They watched him, both of them, sitting bareheaded with his parcel on his knees, staring and staring at the frail blue shape, which seemed like the vapour of something that had burnt itself away. What do you want? They both wanted to ask. They both wanted to say, ask us anything, we will give it to you. But he did not ask them anything. He sat and looked at the island, and he might be thinking, we perished each alone. Or he might be thinking, I've reached it, I've found it, but he said nothing. Then he put on his hat. Bring those parcels, he said, nodding his head at the things Nancy had done up for them to take to the lighthouse. The parcels for the lighthouse men, he said. He rose and stood in the bow of the boat, very straight and tall, for all the world, James thought, as if he were saying there is no God. And Cam thought as if he were leaping into space. And they both rose to follow him as he sprang lightly like a young man, holding his parcel onto the rock. So what makes that a moment of epiphany, both for maybe for the characters, but certainly for the reader? What's powerful about it? Where does its power come from? I think it has a number of reasons for doing this. I think it operates in lots of ways at the same time. There's a lot of parallelism in that passage, and parallelism, as Burke pointed out, is a source of the sublime. And I think you're getting that there too. You're getting the time issues. There's problems about time here. All of a sudden, Mr. Ramsay is a young man again. Time is a really significant thing into the lighthouse and how it works. But the crucial thing, and the reason I like this particular example, is it violates an expectation about narrative structure. When you read a story, you have a big story, and that story's got little bits inside it, episodes inside it. You get proper containment. So the big story is meant to contain all the little stories. The little stories end at the same time as the big story does. That does not happen here. This is the story of how they get to the lighthouse. That's what it's called. Who gets to the lighthouse? Only Mr. Ramsay does. He gets up, he steps onto the rock. His children, Nancy and Cam, stand up behind him. They do not leave the boat. They're still stuck on that boat at the end of the novel, in mid-air, frozen, unable to complete the event. So the small episode is cut off by the ending of the major episode. It's a radical hierarchical violation. And I think that category, that it's a schematic violation of a major kind. And I think the relationship to quantitative learning is, I think if you read 100 novels, you'll find that almost always, when 3 people go somewhere, all 3 people arrive. It doesn't end with one of them arriving and the other 2 just about to arrive. So we've learned something about how novels end. This violates it. It goes against our statistical learning of how novels ought to work, and it produces epiphany. So just to finish off, literary forms are established, they vary, and sometimes they can change in experientially significant ways. And it's possible to understand the establishment and variation of form quantitatively in terms of the text and in terms of knowledge. Quantitative factors contribute to complexity. And I'm just going to skip now to the end point here, which is that I think it's possible to understand complexity. So complexity is important aesthetically, and I think it's possible to understand it to some extent in terms of the ways in which our knowledge is quantized such that it relates to quantities of the world. And Miff Turpin and I published an article last year on Aboriginal ceremony, Australian Aboriginal ceremony, in which we argued that brilliance, which is a complexity effect, produces the effect of ancestral power. So these are powerful ceremonies people engage in, and we argue that it's produced by the cognition of form. But it's the cognition of form at the limits of complexity, again relating loosely to the notion of these things. And I think this is my last, this is really my last point. Entropy is related to surprisal. Oh, so actually, I'm going to skip that. That's too complicated. So just to conclude, last slide. It's possible to theorize both modularized and general knowledge so that it corresponds to and can produce and assess the statistical properties of literary textual data. This knowledge may have been acquired by statistical learning, which I think raises some questions about data, like stolometric consistency. Some of the knowledge depends on sequence, which is methodologically difficult to quantify. But sequence is important for all sorts of reasons, and it's partly important because it's sequential knowledge that forms those expectations, met or violated, form a very important part of our experience of texts.